Hi, Rob McIver here. Let's talk about the weak aorist indicative active in the Greek New Testament and do some thinking about how to make it easier to understand and translate. There's a lot going on with the aorist tenses, and so we have to cover a few topics in this video. I thought it would be helpful to list what they are at the beginning and provide a timestamp just in case you want to skip ahead to something that particularly interests you. Well, the video is going to begin by very quickly reviewing what is an aorist tense and what a strong aorist is. Most of it, though, will be tied up with exploring the weak aorist indicative active. We're going to begin by looking at the paradigm and then seeing how verb stems that end with a guttural, a labial, or a dental interact with the sigma on the ending of the weak aorist. Don't worry, I'll explain all of those terms. We'll look at eo and ao verbs and how they form their weak aorists. And we will look at examples of verbs of each of those categories, as well as some examples of translating the weak aorist indicative active. We will spend some time looking at what is the difference between a weak and a strong aorist and how to recognize them. And we'll do a little exercise together which will illustrate how to tell the difference. And I won't forget to include a number of tips on how to make it easier to recognize, translate, and understand the weak aorists. So now that we've seen where we're going, let's turn to a quick review of what is an aorist tense. So what is the aorist tense? Well, the aorist tense corresponds reasonably closely to the simple past in the English tense system. That's going to give us a head start on how to translate it. But let's think about it in terms of aspect, actions art, and time. By the way, there's a separate video in which I deal with aspect, actions art, and time in the Greek tense system if you wish to consult it. So in terms of aspect, the aorist tense is perfective. That means it's used of completed action. In terms of actions art, punctiliar, inceptive, or used for proverbs or other gnomic sayings. And in terms of time, its time reference is usually past. There are two kinds of aorist tenses. One is a strong aorist and one is a weak aorist, which is just a very nice way to say irregular verbs and regular verbs. Again, there is a separate video on the strong aorists. Let me just remind you of how to approach the strong aorists. Yes, they must be memorized. So just like irregular verbs in English, the connection between eat and ate, one is the present tense and one is the past tense, but they just have to be learnt. So it's the same in Greek. In some ways, this actually makes the strong aorist easier to learn. So let's come to the weak aorists. And here we begin by looking at the paradigm of the weak aorist indicative active of luo. And as you can see, it is elusa, elusas, elusen, elusamen, elusata, elusan. Well, that's reasonably straightforward, isn't it? Yes and no. It has some added complications. You will see that every ending begins with a sigma. And that causes interesting things to happen with many verbs. We'll see that in a second. And also, it begins with a in front of the verb. That also causes interesting things to happen. So while the strong aorists are challenging because you've got to learn them, but once you've learnt them, you don't have to worry about them anymore. With the weak aorist, there's more going on. There's something that can change at the end of the verb stem and something that can change at the beginning. Let's look at some of these changes. There are some standard changes that take place with consonants. For example, gutturals, labials, and dentals all react with sigma in a very predictable manner. Well, this may be the first time you've heard of gutturals, labials, and dentals. What do the terms mean? Well, dentals, for example, are letters that you say using the front of your mouth. Teeth, dental. So, d, t, and th are all dentals. Labials belong in the middle of your mouth. B, p, and f. And gutturals take place towards the back of your mouth. G, h, and h. Yes. So, when a guttural is followed by a sigma, if you say gs, for example, the end sound is like a xi. When a labial, b, for example, is followed by a sigma, if you say bis fast enough, it will sound like a psi. And a dental, well, a dental, it's hard to get your teeth, you're hard to get a th and a s in the same moment as you're speaking. And, well, the dental just disappears. Let's look at some examples of how this happens. Here we have some verbs that have a verb stem that end in a guttural, labial, or a dental. The verb blepo, for example, has a verb stem blep. The last letter is a pi, and when the pi interacts with sigma, it becomes a ps sound, a psi. So, the aorist of blepo is eblepsa. Remember, aorist of luo was lusa. So the aorist of blepo is eblepsa, the p and the s sound combined to a psi sound. The aorist of grapho is egrapsa, the f sound represented by the phi combined with a sigma to make a psi sound. Pempo, similarly, pi plus sigma make psi. Doxadzo is a little bit different. It finishes with a zeta. Now, zetas do interesting things when they combine with sigmas. Some of them do regular things like this one does, and others do, well, their own thing. There's a whole separate section in Intermediate New Testament Greek made easier that deals with verb stems that finish with zeta. Well, for a beginner, and this is beginning New Testament Greek made easier, we'll try and deal with them as they come up. But doxadzo is worth including here because it kind of acts like a dental. So the aorist of doxadzo is doxasa. Pytho, the theta is a dental, so theta plus sigma disappears. So the aorist of pytho is paisa. Sozo is another verb that ends with zeta, but here the zeta acts almost like a dental and disappears. Now there is one really tricky bit here. Did you notice that sozo in the present tense has an iota subscript, but in the aorist tense does not? Whoa, just worth noticing that. I don't have a good explanation of it, but it just happens. Languages do their own thing. Not every verb stem ends with a guttural, labial, or dental. For example, eo and ao verbs have stems that end with epsilon and alpha. Now before the sigma, the epsilon and the alpha lengthen, and thus we have an asa ending consistently on eo and ao verbs. And I have some examples here. Well, let's skip over the first two. We'll come back to those. Let's go down to genao. So the ao lengthens to asa, and the aorist of genao becomes egenasa. And let's look at laleo. Again, the epsilon lengthens to asa, and the aorist of laleo is elalesa. Maturio, similarly, emateruse, and poieo, epoiesa. All straightforward and regular. Now the verbs we skipped over though has something else happening. Not only was something happening at the end of the verb stem, at the beginning of the verb stem, these verbs have a vowel. I guess the summing up of what happens with that vowel is it becomes lengthened. Let's look at the examples again. We'll come back to iteo. There's an extra little bit on iteo. So we have agapeo becomes agapesa. We have erotao becomes aerotesa. So the eo and ao become asa, and the vowel at the beginning lengthens. It also does that with iteo, but you'll notice that there's an iota involved, and quite predictably, the iota becomes an iota subscript to end up with atesa. Well, it's all right going from iteo to atesa, but remember, when we're translating from the Greek New Testament, we see atesa. So we've got to go back to say, well, what did this begin as? Yeah, quite a bit has happened with that verb aiteo. So yeah, just pay attention to it so that when you meet it, you don't have to think too hard and long as to what it might be. Overall though, eo and ao verbs behave very predictably. It's worth noting in passing that there is an exception to this. Kaleo has the aorist ekalesa. Just note it. Well, now that we've seen some of the predictable changes that take place as weak aorist verbs form their aorist, I thought I would summarize them on this slide. So we have the aorist of the regular verb luo formed as follows: elusa, elusas, elusen, etc. But if a regular verb finishes with a consonant that's a guttural, labial, or dental, or an epsilon or an alpha, there are predictable changes that take place, and I've listed them there. And there are predictable changes that take place if the verb stem begins with a vowel. Now that we've seen how the weak aorist verbs are formed, let's look at some examples. Agapo ton adelphon mu. I love my brother. Well, we know agapo is actually agapao, don't we? The alpha and the omega coalesce to be omega. So in the present tense, I love my brother. In English, today I love, yesterday I loved. So when we get to agapesa, ton adelphon mu, it's I loved my brother. Lalai ho Jesus, Jesus speaks, present tense. Ella leisen ho Jesus, Jesus spoke. Laleo, an eo verb, easy, becomes asa at the end and add an epsilon at the beginning. Ella leisan ho Jesus. Final example. Apollou ton oklon ho Ioannes. Actually, you'll notice that this is a not untypical way that the Greek New Testament will handle the subject of the verb. Apolluo is he dismisses. And we already know it's a third person he or she or it, and they can leave the actual subject to the end. So apolluo ton oklon ho Ioannes is John dismisses the crowd. And in English we need John first, but Greek can postpone it. So apolluoi is present tense. Dismisses, present tense, yesterday, dismissed. So ap elusen ton oklon ho Ioannes. John dismissed the crowd. Because it's apo plus luo, isn't it? For apolluoi. So it's ap elusen for the aorist. John dismissed the crowd. So with all that's going on with weak aorists and thinking, well, there's strong aorists as well, you get the feeling there might be an awful lot going on with the aorist tense. Well, there's a little bit going on, but it's okay if we notice some things. All right, strong aorists follow the pattern of elebon, elebes, eleben. So they have their own endings. They're different from the weak aorist endings. So with the strong aorists, we just have to memorize them. So we learned that estheo has an aorist of ephagon, etc. Now, actually, strong aorists turn out to be the easy ones to recognize. So with the weak aorists, what we have is they follow a pattern elusa, elusas, elusen. That's usually a good indication of what a weak aorist is, although I should probably mention in passing that there are some exceptions in the New Testament where a strong aorist verb actually uses a weak aorist ending. They're actually not so bad when you meet them. So with the weak aorist, they follow the pattern elusa, elusas, elusen, and they do exhibit predictable changes. It's just a matter of keeping the changes that can happen to weak aorists in mind when you meet one of these verbs in the New Testament. When you are translating from the New Testament, you're going to be meeting a mixture of strong and weak aorists. So I thought it would be a useful exercise just to model how to work out which is a strong aorist and which is a weak aorist. Now what we have here is we have got some verbs as they might be found in a passage that you're translating. We've got idomen, we've got epigeti, we've got empempsin. They're all in the aorist tense. That's a bit of a hint. And we're eventually going to fill out the table with the first person present indicative active. I domin got the first person present indicative active of horeo. It means I see. The first person aorist indicative active is eidon, meaning I saw. Now, looking down the list, how are we going to know whether they are a weak or a strong aorist? Well, there's a couple of clues. The first clue is the endings that you find on the verbs. We know that a strong aorist will follow the pattern ele bon, ele bes, ele ben. So it's going to be having an on-sn ending. A weak aorist is going to follow the pattern elu sa, elu sas, elu sen. So we'll have a sa or a sas or a sen or a samen or a sate or a san. Now, let's look at some of these verbs and see which pattern they are following. Well, we've got I domin, which is the verb ending that a strong aorist is going to use. We've got eti, which again is the ending a strong aorist would use. We've got epempsen. Bit tricky, because if you look, ele ben finishes with epsilon nu, and elusen finishes with epsilon nu. But we have a sigma involved. Epempsen, is there a sigma involved there? Well, yes, there is. It's hidden in the psi. So that, in fact, is a weak aorist. So sas, well, that's easier, isn't it? The sas ending is clearly the ending of a weak aorist. Agagomen, well, again, that's a strong aorist. Now, what I suggest you do is to fill in the third column, the first person singular aorist indicative active. And why don't you have a bit of fun with this? Why don't you pause the video and work out what you think should be in that column, first person singular, aorist indicative active, and then when you start the video again, you will find the answers. Okay, well, I've listed down there in the first person singular, aorist indicative active, well, exactly that. So idomen is eidon in the first person singular. Ephageti is ephagon. Epempsen is epempsa. Esosas is esosa. Agagomen is agagon. Elelaisen is from elelaisa in the first person, etc. Now that we have that worked out, we can go through and perhaps identify the strong aorist. Now remember, the way we know a verb has a strong aorist is because we have memorized it. They are irregular. The only way to know them is we memorize them. And in fact, you'll see with idomen, for example, the present indicative active is in fact the verb horeo. So the verb stem has changed between the present and the aorist. Now that is the dead giveaway for recognizing a strong aorist. The trouble is, you actually have to know it, don't you? So again, we come back to the fact that if you're trying to understand the aorist tenses, even the weak aorist tenses, the first step is to memorize well the aorist forms of the strong aorist. So if I glance down this list, I recognize idomen, ephageti, agagomen, elabomen, aelthon, and ideti as strong aorists. And here they are, all listed in the table. So ephageti is from estheo, I eat. In the aorist tense, it means I ate. Yes, the English simple past is the most natural translation of the aorist tense. Agagomen comes from the verb ago, which means I lead. And again, you see that the aorist stem is different from the present stem of that verb. In the present tense, ago means I lead. In the past tense, it means I led. Today I lead, yesterday I led. Elabomen is from the verb lambano. Today I take, yesterday I took. Aelthon is from the verb erchomai, which means I go or I come. Let's work this out in terms of today I go, yesterday I went. Today I come, yesterday I came. And bello, yes, you can see that there is a difference between the aorist verb stem and the present verb stem. There's not much of a difference. It's a double lambda in the present tense and a single lambda in the aorist tense. So those are the strong aorists. Now let's see what's happening with the weak aorists. Well, what we have here are the weak aorists. So a pempsen comes from pempo. And while it looks slightly different, we can see that the sen ending, the sigma of the sen ending, has interacted with the p to make sp or psi. And we put an epsilon on the beginning because it's elusar, elusas, elusen as a pattern. Sosas is from the verb sozo. And remember, there's a bit of a gotcha with sozo. It has an iota subscript in the present indicative, but not in the aorist indicative. Elelasen comes from laleo and eo verbs. So the sa, elusar, elusas, elusen. So the sa, sas, sen ending becomes asa, asas, asen, etc. Agapesata comes from agapeo, I love. And again, it's an ao. So the ao becomes asa. Well, this brings me to my tips on how to make the weak aorist easier to recognize, translate, and understand. Now, we're talking about the weak aorist, so you'll be very surprised to see my first tip is to learn the strong aorist vocabulary very, very well. But it's essential. You're looking at a verb, it's in the aorist tense. If it's got a stem that's different to its present indicative, and you recognize it, it's a strong aorist, well, yes, you're way ahead of the game. So knowing the strong aorist is very important. Then you also need to know your vocabulary very well for all verbs. So you know both the strong aorist and the weak aorist, because things happen to weak aorists as they move from the present indicative to the aorist indicative. We have the sigma on the ending interacting with the last letter of the verb stem, if it's a guttural, a labial, or a dental. We have the sigma on eo and ao verbs doing predictable things. And we have an e added to the beginning unless the verb stem begins with a vowel, in which case the vowel will lengthen. Knowing the vocabulary well will help you recognize these. And you may have to work them out the first few times you see them, but you'll quickly get the knack of recognizing a weak aorist ending, especially if you know it follows elusar, elusas, elusen. And you've just seen an example of how we can use that to say, yes, this is in fact a weak aorist verb. So that is how to recognize weak and strong aorists. How do we translate them? In fact, translation turns out to be the easiest thing about aorist verbs in the Greek New Testament. We just translate almost always with the English simple past. And while English verbs have many irregularities, we already know them. So we can recognize today I eat, yesterday I ate, just as they're already. How do we understand them? That is when we start thinking about aspect in particular. We remember that an aorist tense has a perfective aspect. So the tense is used to describe an action that is complete. This usually means it's in the past, and hence we translate it with the English simple past. But the action is complete, and that is what gives the aorist tense its particular character in the Greek New Testament. And my last tip is, as usual, you just need to practice. If you're looking for an exercise with lots of examples of weak and strong aorists in them, you will find such an exercise in chapter 15 of my book, Beginning New Testament Greek Made Easier. This video is part of a series of videos on the grammar of the Greek New Testament. You can most easily find these videos by clicking on the subscribe button below and subscribing to the channel New Testament Greek Made Easier. If you go to that channel, you'll find the videos listed there, amongst which you will see several videos that deal with the aorist tense. There's the strong aorist, there's the weak aorist, there is the aorist of me verbs and the aorist of other interesting verbs as well. Finally, if you found this useful, why don't you let me know by clicking the like button? Thank you.